Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. Steve, it's a pleasure to finally have you on the show. It's been a while, at least me trying to get you on. You're a busy guy. You wrote a lot of books, but we're going to talk about my favorite subject. And please, could you introduce yourself to everyone out there listening?
Hey, thanks a lot, Robbie. Thanks for having me. And it's a pleasure to finally get to meet you face to face. Yeah, my name's Steve Cameron. I live in Los Angeles, California. I've been working in the film and television industry since about 1995, 1996. I became interested in the JFK assassination in the early 1990s when I first saw JFK, the Oliver Stone film, and a documentary series that was aired on the History Channel called The Men Who Killed Kennedy. And that really opened my eyes to the assassination, information that I had never heard before. When I was in high school, I'd always heard it was a lone nut, one guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, had the story. And when I saw Stone's film and I saw the documentary, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, it really upset me and kind of shook me to my core. I tell you mentioned my books, and I appreciate that. One of my books that I wrote called The Deputy Interviews is about a Dallas deputy sheriff named Roger Craig, who witnessed the assassination. I wrote in my introduction a little bit about my journey into the assassination of Kennedy. And I was watching that documentary, The Men Who Killed Kennedy, on TV. While I was watching, my dad walked into the room and he sat there and watched it with me, and he heard what they were talking about. And he looked at me and he said, "Turn that crap off." So he was very upset about it, and I didn't understand. I could see he was visibly upset. And I was like, "Dad, what's wrong? What's wrong?" It's like, "I'll never believe that my government had anything to do with that." And he stormed out of the room.
So when your dad had a response to you like that about the Kennedy assassination, everybody mentions the idea of conspiracy. I believe there was conspiracy just from the people I've talked to and the documents I've looked at. But when a parent tells you that, especially like when you're at a young age as well, too, I mean, that started you getting into the assassination?
Yeah, that documentary did, especially. And because there was information, that they were talking about, I had never heard before. And I mean, admittedly, when you watch a film or a documentary, I was letting that do the research for me. I wasn't, they were presenting a narrative, and I was listening to it and believing it. But then that caused me to look into things myself and reading books and watching other documentaries. And my area of research primarily is about that deputy sheriff, Roger Craig, in Dallas, who witnessed the assassination. And I didn't find his information until around the year 2012. So about 20 years later, since I had seen that documentary. And I had never heard about this deputy sheriff in Dallas. And this was a decorated Dallas deputy sheriff. He had won Officer of the Year 2 years prior. He was awarded by Sheriff Bill Decker that award. He was the youngest officer to ever win that award in the state of Texas. And so he was a very reputable sheriff. And on the day of the assassination, he told reporters what he had seen. Even on the day of the assassination, there's an article printed about him witnessing Lee Harvey Oswald leave the school book depository and get picked up by a Latin man driving a Nash Rambler station wagon and head towards Oak Cliff. Okay, now Oak Cliff is where Officer J.D. Tippit was found shot to death. Whether or not that station wagon had anything to do with it, I don't know. I do know that Roger Craig wrote a manuscript called When They Kill a President. And in that manuscript, when he wrote it, well, he finished it around the year 1971, but in there he says, to this day, I still believe that was Lee Harvey Oswald that I saw get into a Nash Rambler station wagon and head towards Oak Cliff with another man. And this flies in the face of the official narrative. And he wasn't the only one that saw this. There were several witnesses. And in my book, The Deputy Interviews, I document approximately 11 witnesses that witnessed something similar to what Roger Craig saw. Somebody that looked just like Lee Harvey Oswald get in a station wagon with another man and flee the scene. Roger Craig tried to get the license plate of the station wagon, but it took off too fast. He couldn't get it. Later on, he heard that there was a suspect that was arrested at the Dallas Theater, and they were holding him over at Captain Fritz's office. He was Captain Will Fritz was in charge of homicide for the Dallas Police Department. And so he called down there and he said, listen, I think I saw that guy leaving the school book depository. The ID matches who I saw. And Will Fritz said, why don't you come on down and take a look at him? So Roger Craig later on that afternoon went down to Will Fritz's office, and he walked in and he saw Lee Harvey Oswald sitting behind a desk, and he was being interrogated. And Will Fritz turned to Roger Craig. He said, is this the man you saw? And he said, yeah, that's the man. And during the phone conversation, Roger Craig had told Will Fritz that he saw this guy leaving in a station wagon. According to Roger Craig, he said that Will Fritz turned to Lee Harvey Oswald and said, this man saw you leave in a car. He saw you leave in a car with another man. Lee Harvey Oswald at that point got very upset and said, that station wagon belongs to Mrs. Payne. Leave her out of it. Now, Mrs. Payne, I'm sure you're familiar with Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne, Marina Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's wife, was staying with Ruth Payne. And from what I recall, her story was that they had some kind of correspondence regarding the Russian language, and she was going to teach Marina English, and Marina, she was going to help Ruth Payne learn Russian, or help her speak Russian more fluently. And so that was the story. But see, Ruth Payne, her family, she has family ties to the CIA. When her house was, when investigators went to her house after they found out that Lee Harvey Oswald's wife was living there, they confiscated filing cabinets. Now, there was another deputy sheriff by the name of Buddy Walters. Okay, Buddy Walters was a friend of Roger Craig, and we'll talk a little bit more about what happened right after the assassination with Buddy Walters and Roger Craig during their investigation at the scene of the crime. But when they went to Payne's house, they confiscated filing cabinets, okay? Not big filing cabinets, but like little lock boxes, okay? And according to Buddy Walters' police report, and I published this in my book in the Deputy Interviews, he talks about all this anti-Castro names and addresses, and had all kinds of information about these anti-Castro groups. And so it was very suspicious, especially with Lee Harvey Oswald being connected to these groups. And I personally believe, just like Lee Harvey Oswald said, he was a patsy, he was set up. I believe that he was working for the CIA, and they had him planted in there. And Ruth Payne actually helped him get his job at the school book depository, placing him at the scene where they would later set him up in the sniper's nest. She contacted Mr. Truly, who was the manager of the school book depository, and he hired Lee Harvey Oswald on Ruth Payne's recommendation. So there's a lot of strange things going on with the Paynes, the Ruth Payne and her husband. And I just think her story is total garbage, personally. So
What about, can you just give me a little bit of insight on Roger Craig? I mean, I know he was there at the book depository building when they found the rifle. I think everyone called it a Mauser. Then eventually it switches over, but Roger Craig never changed his statement. Craig stayed with that. I think only once, and I think it's 2 different interviews, he might have miscolored the Rambler from like white to a different color, but that's it. His testimony has been like basic all the way through, just straightforward, never wavering from really anything. And it gets into this point where you have Fritz that says Roger Craig was never in that interrogation room. Now, you gave me a little bit of insight on that as well, too, but we know that's not true because Roger Craig was there. And so you're now was Fritz a liar? Now, Bart Camp says Fritz was a filthy liar. So I get into this point
yeah,
now.
absolutely.
So then why is Roger Craig's testimony or none of this? Why is he seen as people will discredit him? And I've talked to people that admire him. And I think honestly, he seems like the most probably best, I wouldn't say best witness, but best kind of answer. And I guess
You
and
just answered your own question because he was the best witness.
I
He
said it.
was the most credible. He was the most, like I said, he was a decorated Dallas sheriff. He had won the, officer of the year just a couple of years prior. For Will Fritz to say he's never heard of a Roger Craig, he's full of bleep. Okay. The guy was full of bleep. And
You can curse if you
there
want.
were some pictures floating around of what people thought was Roger Craig in Will Fritz's office. I actually found another picture of Roger Craig in that office interior. Okay, so he was definitely there. He reported it. It's in the Dallas newspapers on November 22nd, 1963, that Roger Craig went to Will Fritz's office and identified Lee Harvey Oswald in the office. So these people that are trying to discredit Roger Craig, oh, so he planned all this out to create this big lie on the day of the assassination that he went over to Will Fritz's office and identified Lee Harvey Oswald. I mean, that's absurd. It's absolutely absurd.
What was he doing at the book? What was he doing there? Was he there to see the whole motorcade go through, or was it another thing? He's just in the area.
So yeah. So when he reported to work that day, Sheriff Decker called all his deputies into his office, and he said that you're not to take part in that motorcade whatsoever. Okay, you're just to stand outside in street clothes outside the sheriff's office and represent the Dallas County Sheriff's Office. And the reason for this, so you have Dallas County, and then you have the Dallas PD. It was the Dallas PD's jurisdiction. It wasn't the sheriff's office. It wasn't their jurisdiction. And so, if you want to believe Sheriff Decker, I think Decker was a good guy, and I think he meant well. But I think he was probably following orders, and he was probably following orders on orders from Mayor Cabal, I think his name was, and who also had a brother who was in the CIA, headed up the CIA, who was fired by Kennedy over the Bay of Pigs, by the way. So I believe that Decker had his orders, to not help out with the security of the motorcade. So Roger Craig was standing outside the sheriff's office on Houston Street. Houston and Main Street is where the sheriff's office at that time was located. And he watched the motorcade drive right past him and make that right turn on Houston Street off of Main Street. It drove down Houston Street and made that left turn in front of the school book depository on Elm. And then he heard the shots ring out. And like everybody, they started running towards the scene. Roger Craig ran towards the limousine. He saw it take off under the underpass. He immediately saw an officer run behind the picket fence up on atop the grassy knoll area. He followed that officer. He went behind the picket fence. As soon as he got behind there, he saw a woman in a brown Chevy trying to exit that parking lot. Now, this is a parking lot that was reserved for sheriff's deputies and people that worked at the courthouse. He had never seen this woman before. He pulled out his badge. He arrested her. And she pleaded with him. She said, I have to go. I have to get out of here. I have to go. He said, no, you're not going anywhere. He wouldn't let her out. Now, this is a parking lot that had a locked gate. Okay. And the deputies they had to pay monthly fee to use the lot. And they all had a key for it. Now, this woman, he had never seen before. He arrested her. Another deputy sheriff by the name of Lummy Lewis came over. He had more seniority than Roger Craig, and he said, I'll take care of it. I'll take her down to the sheriff's office and we'll get her processed. That's not in the report anywhere. That arrest I believe that was Marita Lorenz, who was Frank Sturgis's girlfriend. Okay. I think who that woman was. That does not show up in the official record. Roger Craig then went over to the picket fence where people started to gather because they heard shots coming from that area. And he was approached by a man named Arnold Rowland and his wife. Arnold Rowland said, he came up to Roger Craig and he said, listen, my wife and I, we were here for the motorcade. in Dealey Plaza. We got here about 15 minutes before it came through here. We noticed up on the 6th floor of the school book depository that there were two men in the windows with guns. Two, not one, two. And they said that they didn't think anything of it. They thought it must have been part of the security detail for Kennedy. But then when he was shot, they, put two and two together and thought that the two were related. And so that's why they told Roger Craig. He took their statement. Roger Craig then went across the street where he saw Deputy Sheriff Buddy Walters, who we spoke about earlier. And Buddy Walters was examining an area near the curb by the grass where there was a bullet in the grass and there was blood and brain matter from where Kennedy, now this is on the south side of Elm Street, where this blood and this brain matter, and there's pictures of it, and I printed it in my book, The Deputy Interviews. Okay, it says there's a bullet in the grass. A man identifying himself, he was in a black suit, walked over to the bullet. He said, "I'm FBI," walked over to the bullet, bent down, picked it up, put it in his pocket, and walked away. Those pictures are also published in my book. And there's a lot more information about that in there. At that moment, after that man walked in there and grabbed the bullet. Now, this is a bullet that also didn't show up in the official record, but guess what? I dug up, I'll send it to you. I found a file, okay, an FBI file of Bob Barrett, Robert Barrett, who this man looks just like, and he was also identified by his supervisor, last name Gemberling, from the FBI in Dallas. Researcher Mark Oakes in the 1990s had these photos, and he said, "Who does this look like?" to FBI agent Gemberling, and he said, "That looks like Bob Barrett." I'm pretty sure that's Bob Barrett. He has him on video saying this, and I also printed that in my book. And so this man is identified as Bob Barrett, he was admittedly on the scene in Dealey Plaza, and he was also at the scene of the Tippit shooting, where two wallets were found, by the way. Okay. So I think possibly Bob Barrett might have had something to do with setting up Lee Harvey Oswald at the Tippit scene. He confiscated that bullet, possibly, if that was Bob Barrett, walked away with it. And then the document that I found with Barrett's name on it, he sent the bullet to Washington, D.C. And so after that happened, Roger Craig then hears what he called a shrill whistle coming from across the street near the school book depository. He looked up and he saw a man in a Rambler station wagon leaning over, whistling. And then he saw Lee Harvey Oswald. He didn't know it was Lee Harvey Oswald at the time. He only found out that afterwards, and when he identified him at Will Fritz's office. Saw Lee Harvey Oswald run down from the school book depository. The man driving the car opened the door so he could get into the front seat. Lee Harvey Oswald got in the front seat, and they took off and they headed towards Oak Cliff, where J.D. Tippit was found shot to death later on. Then at that point, Roger Craig says that somebody said that they found the sniper's nest. They heard somebody shouting. It might have been Luke Mooney, Officer Luke Mooney, shouting from the 6th floor of the school book depository. Everybody rushes into the school book depository, including Roger Craig. He goes up to the 6th floor. He walks into the sniper's nest, and immediately he sees something very strange. He sees 3 brass shell casings lying side by side like this, all facing the same direction on the floor, about an inch apart, which is very strange. If you've ever shot a gun that ejects shells, they don't line up side by side about an inch apart, all facing the same direction.
And if it's hitting ground, it rolls.
Exactly. And so he thinks that somebody, took him out of their pocket or whatever and put him there, planted him. Now, if you look at the crime scene photos that were taken much later in the day, and we can prove that by the way the shadows are, where the sun was when the pictures were taken, they were taken later in the day. The shells are scattered. Okay, whether or not maybe somebody came in there and kicked them by accident or kicked them on purpose because it looked like it was, this is 2-staged, we don't know. But the photos that the Warren Commission has in their volumes, it says that the shells scattered. So after that, I believe it was Officer Eugene Boone began looking for a rifle, and Roger Craig was about 8 to 10 feet behind Boone, and they were walking in the same direction. And Boone looked behind some boxes, and he saw a rifle, and he yelled out rifle. And they looked at it, and sure enough, there was a rifle tucked in between a couple of boxes on the school book depository on the 6th floor. Then the evidence man, Lieutenant J.C. Day, came over, pulled it out, and he handed the weapon to Captain Will Fritz, head of homicide. He was on scene. And Will Fritz cocked the gun, and another shell, exactly, cocked the gun, another shell ejected out onto the floor, right? So it's just the chain of custody is just, it was such a shoddy job by the Dallas Police Department, the way they were handling evidence. So Fritz at that point says, does anybody know what kind of gun it is? And then there was a man by the name of Constable Seymour Weitzman, who also worked for the sheriff's office. He was a deputy. He said, I can, because this guy was a weapons expert. He had owned a sporting goods store. He's very familiar with guns. And he looked at it and he said, it's a Mauser. And he examined it. I printed his sworn affidavit in my book. And he very detailed, he describes the scope, he describes the sling that was on the rifle. He just, says it's a Mauser, a 7.65 Mauser to be specific. And the rifle that they tried tying to Oswald was a 6.5 Italian rifle, and it says it's made in Italy right on it. There's a stamp. There's no misidentifying that rifle if you look at it. And that's when, not too long after that, somebody ran up the stairs. Another police officer said that there's been an officer shot in Oak Cliff. Now, Roger Craig looked at his watch when this happened, and he looked at his watch, and it said 1:06 p.m. on his watch. Maybe the time was off a little bit, but I did corroborate that time. There were witnesses that were driving past the Tippit crime scene, and they said it was approximately between 1:05 and 1:10 p.m. Now, that makes it impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to arrive there at that time and do the shooting. The absolute most time that the Warren Commission could give him, I believe that they said that the shooting happened between 1:15 and 1:25 p.m.
It's funny because if you read where Tippett's memorial page is, it says 1:06.
Then that's the right time. And that makes it impossible. If you look at the warrant, the official time of the shooting, it's after 1:15 p.m. And that makes it impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to commit the shooting. He just didn't have time to do it.
So if Roger Craig's noticing all this,
based on the official narrative of them saying that he got in a cab and then he got in a bus and then he walked and he did this and he did that, there's just no way he didn't have time. If he got in that Rambler station wagon, he had time.
well, if Roger Craig is noticing that the official narrative after Oswald's dead and everything, like, does he continue down this long road of investigating all of this, much like every other researcher starts looking into this? I'm curious where that takes him, because like I said, I know about his death. I know his son has done a couple of talks as well too, but
yeah, I'm friends with his son. I'm friends with the entire Craig family. I didn't write this book until I had their permission. I actually went to the son and Roger Craig's granddaughter and some of his cousins. I'm friends with his cousins, nephews, and his sister-in-law. I interviewed for my book, and the reason why it's called The Deputy Interviews is because I interview all these people in his family, people that knew him, friends of Roger Craig. And none of them believe that he committed suicide. I believe there's like one person that's come out of the woodwork and said that they didn't believe, in the family, that said that Roger Craig was a liar and, that he was kicked out of the military and all this nonsense. I printed Roger Craig's military records. Okay. He was honorably discharged. He did his service. He was a POW. He was tortured in Korea. He actually served in the military twice. He ran away at the age of 13 from Wisconsin, and he hopped on a freight train and he went to the state of Montana, and he was working on ranches. And then he decided he's like, he didn't want to do that anymore. So I'm going to join the military. He used his older brother's name, his older brother Donald's name, to enlist in the military. So he joined the military when he was like 15 years old. And then he got caught, he got kicked out of the military, and then he rejoined when he was 17, 18. So the guy was a hero.
After he points out Oswald in Fritz's office, can you take me what his events were after that, even if it's later in life when he's investigating it on his own?
Yeah, absolutely. So after that happened, he gave some interviews to some reporters, because those articles do appear in the Dallas newspapers, that Officer Craig, and they name him, went over to Will Fritz's office and identified Lee Harvey Oswald in there as the man he saw. And then he went home. I spoke to his son and I asked him the same question. I was like, what was that like? What was that when your dad came home that day? What was it like? And he said that his dad came in, and they turned on the TV and they were watching all the the news footage, and he just kept saying over, according to his son, just kept saying over and over, it's not right. This ain't right. Something's wrong here. Something's wrong. And he was very disturbed by it from day one. And where he got in trouble was he told people about what he saw. He told, I don't know if you're familiar with the radio personality Paul Harvey. He was a very famous radio newsman back in the 60s and 70s. And he had read some of those articles that Roger Craig was also quoted in books. People that were writing books came and interviewed him, and he told them what he saw. And Paul Harvey got wind of it, and he went to Roger Craig's house, and they videotaped an interview with him. And Roger Craig said the same thing. Like you said, he never changed his story. And you asked, why are all these people doing this? Besides that one relative, and I don't want to say anything bad about somebody's, we all got people in our family, that you might not get along with. And I think there might've been something about like going on there with that. But, everybody that knew him loved him and respected him, at least the people that I talked to, and said that he was very honest. And he loved his country, and then Jim Garrison was starting his investigation into Clay Shaw. For your viewers that have seen Oliver Stone's J.F.K., most of that movie is about Jim Garrison and his investigation of the Kennedy assassination and how it led to the businessman Clay Shaw in New Orleans. And so Jim Garrison contacted Roger Craig, and Roger Craig wouldn't go to New Orleans to testify. He just, because Sheriff Bill Decker, he ordered all of his deputies not to talk to anyone. And he found out that Roger Craig had spoken to one of Garrison's investigators, called him into his office, and I believe this was in 1966, and he fired him. He said, you were talking to Garrison's investigators. Or he said, you were talking to Garrison, I told you not to. And Roger Craig didn't lie. He said, no, I didn't talk to Garrison. But he had actually talked to one of his investigators that contacted him, trying to get him to go to New Orleans. And then after he was fired, he figured he had nothing else to lose. So he did go to New Orleans, and he testified, or he signed a sworn affidavit. And then he eventually testified in that trial of Clay Shaw in the late 1960s.
Did he ever question like who else was involved in this cover up? I mean, if he's getting fired just for speaking to someone about the investigation of a death of a president, I'm starting to wonder, is like, was that known around the office? Like, hey, don't do any of this. Not just saying, hey, don't talk to Garrison, but don't even talk about the assassination in general.
Yeah. If I'm not going to be able to obviously cover everything in this interview. So let me just say this first. So if anyone wants to learn more about Roger Craig and what he witnessed and who he believed was involved, okay, and if they don't want to pay the money to buy the book that I published, It's called When They Kill a President. You can probably find free copies online if you just do a search. But if you want to buy a copy or read an ebook, it's called When They Kill a President. That's in Roger Craig's own words. Yeah, it's on Amazon and it's on most online book distributors. You can find it, and like I said, there are free copies available. Um, so he laid it all out in that manuscript. And this is a manuscript that he had sent to a man by the name of Penn Jones, if you're familiar with Penn Jones. Penn Jones befriended Roger Craig because Roger Craig had several attempts on his life. And when Jim Garrett, especially when Jim Garrison began talking to him, and after he came back from New Orleans after testifying or signing a sworn affidavit for Garrison, he was coming out of a diner in Dallas and he was shot at. Somebody took a shot at him and tried to kill him. And the bullet grazed the side of his head. His son, when his dad came home, he saw it. He saw the burn mark on the side of his head. He had just missed it. And so he contacted Garrison's office immediately, said, somebody just tried to kill me. And Garrison said, don't go anywhere. Don't leave the house. I'm going to send somebody over. And he sent Penn Jones over to his house because Garrison was working with Penn Jones as well. And then Penn Jones and Roger Craig became good friends and kind of worked on the case together. Roger Craig would, tell Penn Jones what he was digging up because he still had friends at the sheriff's office. Right now, we're working on finding a military footlocker that contains a bunch of information that Roger Craig was working on. And I'm working with one of Roger Craig's relatives to try to retrieve that. This footlocker possibly contains reel-to-reel tapes, recordings of the day of the assassination that no one's ever heard before, things that might put some puzzle pieces together. So Roger Craig was turning all this information over to Garrison's office, and he had when he penned his manuscript, he sent it to Penn Jones because Penn Jones was a publisher. He published a newspaper out of Midlothian, Texas, and he was very involved in the conspiracy angle of the assassination. All a conspiracy is, I mean, people say, oh, you believe it's a conspiracy that all a conspiracy is two people to get together. I mean, I break it down like this, okay? When you were younger, when you were a kid, okay, and you had a beef with a kid down the block, right? Or the other kid had a beef with you. He'd go out and he'd get one of his friends and they'd come over and have a word with you. Or, you know what I'm saying? That's a conspiracy. That's two people getting together and doing something that might be against the law or not so legal. So he had sent this manuscript to Penn Jones, and then Roger Craig he kept getting threats on his life. He had his car blown up. He was driven off the road. He opened his front door. He was shot in the chest with a shotgun.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
I don't know any about this being driven off the road, or I heard a car blow up, but nobody ever explained it.
Have you ever seen his interview with Lincoln Carl?
I've seen one where he had a black background. It looked like he was sitting on a comfy chair and he was talking about Rambler.
So if anybody wants to, including yourself, Robbie, on my YouTube channel, just go to YouTube and type in Steve Cameron Productions, and you'll find the documentary that Lincoln Carl conducted with Roger Craig about less than a year before Roger Craig was murdered. And this interview happened in 1974, and he lays it all out. And if you watch it, just watching this guy, I mean, at least me, I think he's telling the truth. He just seems like one of the most honest people, speaking. He talks about all of that, about what, all the attempts on his life. And after, I believe it was after his car was blown up, he contacted Penn Jones. He said, listen, don't publish my manuscript, because he was afraid. Not necessarily for himself, but he was afraid for his family. He even I published the letter that he wrote to Penn Jones in my book, and he was very afraid at this point. He was afraid for his family.
Did his son ever mention anything about what he was going through, like the breakdown? I mean, being basically trying to be killed multiple times. Did he talk about all this?
Yeah, I interviewed him for my book. It's all in there. All the interviews are in there. He talks about, see, at the time, his son, Roger Craig Jr., around the age of 17, he got married, he had a baby, and he brought it over to go, just to his dad to show that, his dad was a grandpa, And so he brought him over to the house, and his dad said, "Get the hell out of here. I don't ever want to see you again," and told him to leave. And at the time, his son was devastated. He thought, he didn't understand what he did. He didn't understand what was wrong. But now that he looks back on it after everything that happens, and he also believes his dad was murdered, he believes that his dad was looking out for him. And he didn't want him to be involved in what he was going through.
So how did his dad die?
So on May 15th, 1975, he was found shot to death in his bedroom. At the time, he was living with his father because he was recuperating from a shotgun blast from opening a door where he was staying at a hotel room. I mean, the guy was, every time he got fired from the Dallas Sheriff's Office, he would get a job, and then his employer would get a phone call and say, tell him, "Hey, this is the Roger Craig conspiracy guy." He thinks, just to try to get him fired. And so he couldn't hold the job, because every time he would get a job, his employer would find out who he was, and then they'd fire him. And so at this point in his life, around 1975, he was recuperating from a shotgun blast at his dad's house, and his dad found him laying on the floor. The rifle that was found was a .22 rifle, and it was laying long ways on the bed, away from the body. His body was found in the middle of the room on the floor. The bed was up against a wall, and several feet away, and the gun was lying long ways. The bullet trajectory was on a downward angle, down like this, and exited his back. It missed all of his vital organs, and he bled to death. That's how he died. He had a service revolver, or he owned 2 revolvers, I believe his son said, and they were found found on top of the dresser in his bedroom. So why in the world would somebody try to commit suicide using a .22 rifle, holding a rifle up, pointing down? His son also said when he examined the body at the morgue, his son identified the body. His father had ligature marks around his wrists, and he had bruises on his knees, like he had been forced down on the floor, possibly with his hands tied behind his back. The Dallas coroner ruled it a suicide about a week, 2 weeks later, officially. And that was the end of it. Until I started releasing information about what happened to him by interviewing his family. That's why I got involved with this, Robbie. I was like you. I was like, who is this guy? Like, I hear people talking all this, bad stuff about him, saying how he's a terrible person. And then all these other people are saying how great he was. And I just thought his story just blew the official narrative out of the water. I mean, he sees Oswald running from the school book depository. He sees a Mauser. It's a completely different rifle in the school book. And so I decided to go straight to the source. I went to the family members. I went to people like Gary Shaw. If you're familiar with Gary Shaw, wrote a book called Cover Up in the mid-1970s. He was good friends with Roger Craig. He was also good friends with Penn Jones. And he knew Roger Craig. And he said that I convinced him after I presented everything that I had. He was convinced that Roger Craig was murdered.
Did anybody check the room where he was when he was killed? Did he leave a note, or how did they get into his house?
Yeah. So his grandfather, or not his grandfather, Roger Craig's son's grandfather. Roger Craig's father, his name was Crystal Craig. He was in World War II, and he was in the Navy, and he worked on by the guns, during World War II. And so his hearing was damaged. He was practically deaf. And so at his house, he had a system set up with a light on the back porch that if he had a phone, or if somebody was at the door or somebody needed to talk to him, they'd turn the light switch on because he was always in the yard he was always in the yard working. And the house that they lived in was right across the street from an armory. So they were always having drills and training and guns going off and things like that. So for a gun, whether or not he heard a gunshot, see, I talked to the last living person, and she's still alive. Her name's Deanie Wood. She was Roger Craig's sister-in-law. She was married to Roger Craig's brother, Donald. She saw Roger Craig. Her and her husband saw Roger Craig the day that he died, and said that he was in good spirits. They were planning on going fishing in Oklahoma the following week. Roger Craig told them that he had just renewed his driver's license, and at the same time, he got his fishing license because he didn't want to get a ticket as long as his right arm. He was like joking about it. And he didn't want to get a ticket for, fishing without a license. So this guy had plans, I mean, who renews their driver's license if they're just going to, kill themselves? Robert Groden, if you're familiar with Robert Groden, I interviewed him for my book. He had a scheduled face-to-face interview with Roger Craig the day that he died. Okay. Congressman Downing out of Virginia, he's the congressman that put the House Select Committee together on assassinations. They were going to reopen, well, they did reopen the JFK assassination and the assassination of Martin Luther King. When he was forming the House Select Committee, Robert Groden was an aide working for Congressman Downing. And he knew about Roger Craig, and he sent Groden down to Dallas to interview Roger Craig for the House Select Committee. He was a key witness. Now, what a lot of people don't understand, Roger Craig was a key witness. Like the Warren Commission interviewed him as well. And they changed his testimony approximately 14 times, according to Roger Craig. And he documents that in his manuscript because he got a copy of the volumes of the Warren Commission. He went through them. He's like, that's not what I said. They like changed the story like a little bit here and there to fit their narrative. And so Groden had this scheduled interview to meet with Roger Craig. He flies down, he lands at Love Field, he brings his wife, he's going down there to interview people like Penn Jones and other people closely related to the case, Roger Craig being the primary witness that he wanted to speak to. And he got off the plane and he was greeted by Penn Jones and J. Gary Shaw and I believe Larry Harris, who was also an investigator, who also died kind of mysteriously. Some people believe that he may have been killed. But they all met at the airport, Robert Groden getting off the plane, and they told him what happened to Roger. They said that they found him dead, and he asked him why, and they said, well, they think it's a suicide. And so I just think it's very strange that Robert Groden would have the scheduled interview, a Washington, D.C. congressman sending him down to interview him, and then he's found dead under very mysterious circumstances.
Yeah, the son raised hell when he went.
Oh yeah, his dad to his dying days said that Roger Craig never killed himself. He said that rifle, that he had never seen that rifle in the house before. Roger didn't own a rifle. This is according to his family members, people that knew him, explained this to me, including his son. And yeah, Roger Craig's son would be a great interview for you. I just don't think he's hooked up for Zoom and stuff like that. He's kind of off the grid. He has a cell phone. If you ever want to talk to him, I can put you in touch with him.
Yeah, please do. I mean,
or if you want to know more about his story, I'll send you a copy of my book, Robbie. I think I offered it to you a while back, but I'll send you a copy. Just send me an address, and I'll get all the information to you so you can take a look at it.
I've defended Roger Craig because I've looked at his testimonies.
You look a little like him. We're trying to put a movie out. Here in Hollywood, we're trying to put a movie together about him. And you look a lot like him.
I'll play the part.
A young Roger Craig.
But I think it's
do any acting? You do any acting?
I look like Tom Holland, they say. But I do a little when it came to looking through his testimonies, I've defended him because he's the only one that stayed consistent from a lot of the people. And then a lot of the ones that do get credit. I mean, you start to see this as well too. Tom O'Neill wrote a book about the Manson murders. And if you look into the Manson murders, guess who's one of these people that wrote a book? Vincent Bugliosi. His name comes up because he prosecuted in the Manson murders. Well, they committed perjury in the Manson murders. They put a prosecutor on the defendant's side to sabotage the thing. And you find out Bugliosi has, I mean, he beat a woman so bad when she was pregnant, she had an abort, like not an abortion, she had a miscarriage. So you find out all these people that are getting the star news, that are getting the headlines, that are just
Oh
saying
yeah,
the
and the
official.
grants, they get grants for these books. Guys like Gerald Posner or Bugliosi. Bugliosi. I think he got like, I don't know, over $1 million to write that piece of garbage that he wrote about the Kennedy assassination.
To agree with the official story means you're siding on that with all that, those people that represent that. And you start looking at their back history and you go, well, they didn't just have one good moment of faith where they chose right. And even with Bugliosi, he thought the RFK thing was a conspiracy. So the JFK thing, he was straight on. The RFK, he wasn't. And you just get to this point and go, when you look at any of the people that are involved in the Tippit killing, the murder of Oswald, Jack Ruby, I mean, did you talk to Roger Craig's son about his thoughts on Jack Ruby or any involvement that Roger Craig did?
Yeah, some of these people I interviewed for the book, like for instance, J. Gary Shaw knew Jack Ruby, who I interviewed for my book. I interviewed him for my book, and he tells the story about meeting Jack Ruby. Gary Shaw was a doo-wop singer back in the 50s and early 60s. And so he performed at Jack Ruby's, clubs, some of these, places where Jack Ruby would have these events. And he told me that, yeah, everyone knew who Jack Ruby was, that he was, connected.
But you didn't know any Dallas police. You didn't know anybody.
You didn't know. And I appreciate you having me on and let me talk about my books and stuff. And I hate to keep promoting, but in my book, I print an FBI file of a former defender from Dallas who was actually, he had worked in Dallas as a public defender. I think he actually worked at one point, he was working for the prosecution, but he started working as a defender. He practiced law approximately 20 years there in Dallas. And after the assassination happened, he contacted the FBI after Ruby after Ruby killed Oswald. He contacted the FBI and he said, look, Will Fritz and Jack Ruby are best friends. Okay. He might not have said best friends. He said good friends. And he suspected that Will Fritz put Ruby up to killing Lee Harvey Oswald. The FBI took it so serious, they went to San Francisco and interviewed him. And I printed that document in my book. And yeah, like if you watch that footage of them bringing Oswald out there in the garage, down in the parking garage, you can see Will Fritz wave his hand. And as soon as he goes like this, Jack Ruby pops out and shoots him.
And the famous line, Jack, you son of a bitch, comes. Well, I mean, with Roger Craig, did he have anybody he could trust around any of this? I've seen a video, if I'm not mistaken, that's a video of him and Richard Bartholomew checking out a Rambler at some point.
Oh, Rick, yeah, he's a great researcher, Richard Bartholomew. I met him in Dallas a couple of years ago. He's a really good guy. Actually, some of his information helped me in my research. But yeah, Roger Craig towards the end of his life didn't trust anybody except maybe one person, and her name was Rita Musgrove. And she was also kind of like a citizen researcher into the case, and she contacted Roger Craig because she had read some of the newspaper articles of him seeing Oswald, and they became good friends. She actually edited his manuscript. And do you know who Harold Weisberg?
I use his archives.
Okay, exactly. Yeah, so and you can find it in the archives. His correspondence with Rita Musgrove in the middle of the night after Roger Craig was murdered. She contacted Harold Weisberg in the middle of the night, frantic, and said they killed him. And he's like, who? And the people he trusted. Okay. She said he didn't trust any of those people, any of the people in Dallas. He distrusted Jim Garrison towards the end of his life. And people said, oh, he was just paranoid. Well, I mean, when somebody tries to kill you 5 times, I think
I got to ask about the shotgun blast to the chest. That's nuts. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, he was in a hotel, I believe, in Waxahachie. Is that how you say it? I don't know. It's in Dallas or in Texas. Um, in Texas, he was living, and he opened his hotel room door, got a knock on it, and he saw like a silhouette of somebody, and they took a shot at him with a shotgun. And they rushed him to the hospital. And his son said that they even tried to say that he committed suicide that time.
I mean, at some point, he had to just start writing stuff down or making videos or doing something. And I know you talked about the storage, the storage locker room thing.
Yeah, yeah, we're working on that right now.
I'm just,
Also, possibly Lee Harvey Oswald's some of his information in there connecting him to the CIA as well.
I mean, the man had to do private investigations after this. You have to think you're watching literally a historic event just be told a blatant faced lie, and you know what happened. And when you do try and say something about it, you do try and contact somebody, you have attempts on your life to a point where you probably get so paranoid, you just want to cut everybody off in fear, not only for your own life, but for others.
His son, yeah, his son said when he was younger, before his father told him to leave and never come back, uh, he would put it all on reel to reel, like back in the day, reel to reel, and he would record it. Everything that he saw, everything that he witnessed, his investigations into what he, was looking into about the case. He was actually working for Jim Garrison to get information in Dallas on people. He was setting up meetings with people. He met a guy, I believe he met a guy who was in a bowling alley, and the guy said that I think he said something about he knew who killed Kennedy, and so he invited him to to come back to his place to show him the evidence. And they go back to this place, and I think it was a hotel room, and they go in the hotel room, and then the guy pulls out from under the bed like a case of guns, and he's like holding the guns, and just in like a very intimidating manner, basically a threat to Roger Craig. And then Roger Craig, he said when he went back to his car, he started it up and it blew up.
When you were doing your interviews for your book, how difficult was it for you to be able to at least ask these questions to the family members? I mean, they're not, I'm guessing they're not open to talking about a lot of this stuff.
Well, I haven't told you about my background, and I can we can talk about that a little bit if you want.
Yeah, please do. You seem like a Hollywood guy. You seem like are you a journalist? Don't tell me you're a journalist.
I was.
Okay.
I'm a citizen journalist.
All right.
I post on Twitter like a lot of people, and Facebook, and interesting things that I think that's interesting, and I think people should be aware of.
We swing in the same
Do I
section
get
of the
paid
COVID.
for it? No, I used to work for NBC a long
shit.
time ago.
About to say
Yeah.
we swing in the same area when it comes to the COVID topic, which we'll have to do a whole separate episode on. But
Yeah, that's get ready for that to be ramped up again, because I think only 4% of I don't want to say I don't want to drop any trigger words here
YouTube will flag
for the
us.
algos
Just
the algos.
About your background though, like I mean, besides the interest when you're a child, or when you hear your dad say like don't buy anything the government tells you, but I mean, to be able to write a book and do the interview process, like I mean, what led you to deciding to want to write a book, and especially focus on Roger Craig? Is it because there's not a whole lot of people that really have tackled that angle? I've noticed every researcher has gone a specific, very specific, I think it's Penn Jones statement, which is find one aspect of the case and research the hell out of it. But Roger Craig was something, that I picked up on. Same thing with Ruby. Those two were the ones that I was kind of focused into, looking at their statements and seeing that.
So in 2012, my father was found shot to death. Okay, he was shot 5 times, and it was ruled a suicide. Okay, this happened in the state of Florida, and at the time, my mom had died about 10 days before, and then my dad, was found shot, and so we thought, maybe that's, they were married like 50 years, 55 years, and he was pretty heartbroken. We all were, me and my family, and then information started trickling out, and You know, my dad was in his 70s, mid 70s, and the gun that was used was a 357 Blackhawk. Okay, it's not a small gun. Uh, Held 5 shots. You know, empty. You know, the whole all the brass was in the revolver, and yeah. So yeah, so when that started coming out, you know, very strange things with the people who investigated that case, and that's still being worked on right now. And I started looking into suspicious suicides, and I was already very heavily involved in the JFK assassination research, and probably because the algorithms or whatever, I found a link to that Lincoln Carl interview. Actually, it wasn't Lincoln; it was a Lincoln Carl interview, but it was used in a documentary called "Evidence of Revision," and I highly recommend that documentary to anybody that wants to learn more about the JFK assassination. And they had clips of Roger Craig's interview in there from 1974, and I guess it was maybe a kind of a cathartic way by throwing myself into Roger Craig's case. It kind of helped me cope a little bit and not focus so much on what was going on with my dad and myself and my family.
You mentioned making a film about Roger Craig. What angle are you tackling that from?
We're tackling it from from the day of the assassination and forward.
Because I'd watch the hell out of that. I've never seen, like, from a deputy view, like what happened with Roger Craig that day, just following him. We always see the big picture. Obviously, the medical evidence gets brought into one film, or there's a lot of things that get brought in, mostly focusing around researchers. And I guess it's hard if you don't have the production money to recreate a whole scenario. But I would love to see a Roger Craig film, of just his whole events, that whole entire day, his whole life afterwards as well, too. I mean, you got to think, man, you're, it's like the JFK community. A lot of people believe conspiracy a lot more than the normal, I would say, which would be usually in cases like this, it's kind of like lone nutters are the mainstream. But no, it's more people believe that there was a conspiracy. That's why we have the 1035 document about any new evidence against the Warren Commission. You label it as a conspiracy because 60 something% of people believe that there was conspiracy that day. It would just be interesting to see how many people hop on board and support, this angle of Roger Craig, maybe get his name out there as well, too, for people that aren't fully into the JFK community. But that's a good movie angle.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons I gravitated towards his case. It wasn't so much of the JFK. You know, that's very interesting. But what this man went through and what his family went through
Still going through.
and still going through to this day, absolutely. And yeah, I got together with a screenwriter out here. He's my writing partner, a guy by the name of Steven Zephyr. He wrote and produced a film called Heist in 2016 with Robert De Niro, and it was all about the mafia and police corruption. And I thought that he would be perfect, the perfect person to write the script. And I was friends with a friend of him, and we all got together and we put the script together. And he was not as deep into the JFK assassination stuff as like myself or you, but he had seen a movie called Executive Action, and it's one of his favorite movies. And he was very intrigued when I brought the idea to him, and he volunteered to write the script. And we wrote that in 2018, 2019, and we began shopping it in 2020. We got some offers, and then what happened in 2020. Hollywood kind of shut down, and so we're trying to relight that candle right now. We'll see where that goes from here.
Well, Steve, I really appreciate the time you've given me to talk on my show, man. And I appreciate the work that you've done too. It couldn't have been easy interviewing, his family and trying to put all the work that you did into your books.
Well, thank you.
Is there a place where people can find your books and any other links you'd like to promote as well too?
Yeah, I'll throw that out, but I'd also like to. I want to get I would like to get your opinion on something and what you think about this. But if anybody wants to read more about Roger Craig, and I can, let me pull it out right here. This is the book. I don't know if you're going to be able to see that well on
Yeah.
camera, but you can go to Amazon, you can pick up a copy. It's there, an ebook if you prefer reading Kindle and things like that. And the patient is dying. You're not going to see this well. This is When They Kill a President right here. These are all available on Amazon. And you can also get, if you prefer, if you like getting author signed copies, that kind of stuff, you can go to my website, stevecameronproductions.com, and I have links there on how people can get a signed copy with a personalized inscription written to them, and I'll mail that out to them anywhere in the world. And but I wanted to get your opinion on this. Now, this is one of the most fascinating things. See, I didn't know about this. I learn something new every day. And when looking into this case, there's so much information. And I believe it was one of your interviews recently with, we were talking, what was the gentleman from the UK?
Bart Camp?
Yes, exactly. He was talking about how he likes to look at the archives, the information in the archives, and I do too. See, all my research isn't just Roger Craig, and I wrote the deputy interviews, and I put a little bit in there for everybody, for people that are new to the case, and people that look at it every day, like myself, and find new things. I'm going to put this in my second edition. I didn't know about this, and I probably should have. There was a guy. So are you familiar with the bullet that they found on the stretcher?
Yeah.
That
The one that
supposedly
was by a
fell out of
stethoscope?
it fell out of Connolly's leg or something like that. Yeah. Now, this is the crux of the Warren Commission's findings, the magic bullet, right? This bullet that was basically pristine that they found, right? It goes through Kennedy. It goes through Connolly 5 times, like through his back. It travels down, hits him in the rib, exits, hits him in the wrist, one of the hardest bones in the body.
And his knee.
Doesn't morph, doesn't turn flat, still pristine. And then embeds itself in his thigh. Okay. Not only is it impossible for that Arlen Specter's theory of the single bullet, the magic bullet, I found this information. The person who was in charge of the autopsies at Bethesda, his name was Lieutenant Colonel Pierre Fink, Dr. Fink. He was interviewed by the Warren Commission, and he was asked by Arlen Specter. He said that bullet. Now, this is in for researchers out there that want to look this up. In volume 2 of the Warren report on page 382, it's that bullet, Warren Commission Exhibit 399. He was asked by Arlen Specter, was this the bullet that damaged Connolly's wrist? And he said, no, there are too many fragments in the wrist. Meaning that when that bullet was weighed, it wasn't missing enough fragments. There were far more fragments in the wrist than came off that bullet. So it is impossible for the single bullet theory to be true. There's many other reasons why that single bullet theory isn't true, but just based on this bullet, and this is the Warren Commission's own evidence, it's impossible. The bullet was too intact. There were more pieces of lead in Connolly's wrist than came off that bullet.
Yeah, it was one of the issues with Connolly's wife. After he died, they wanted to do an autopsy. They wanted to check his remains, and they wanted to scan like for that same. I think Oliver Stone said it on a Joe Rogan podcast. He mentioned doing that, but she wouldn't have it. She didn't want any of that stuff being done on him. And so that's missing as well too. Same thing with like the Harper fragment, the brain, a lot of this messed up medical evidence and stuff. A lot of this stuff could have been easily, might have been answered or might have been solved. But a lot of the family members, a lot of people that obviously you have to ask their permission to be able to do any of this type of stuff. They just don't want to have it. They just want to bury it behind them. It's the main reason Marina Oswald doesn't do phone calls or doesn't do interviews anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah. Well, Robbie, I appreciate you, and I really appreciate what you're doing for the case. You're a young guy, And I think you're really helping your generation and generations before you.
We'll figure it out somehow, but I appreciate your
You're
time.
going to solve it. I really think
No, no, no.
if anyone is going to be the guy, you're the guy. Okay. That's going to do it.
I'm gonna
I
end up.
really believe it.
I would just want to go on air and say, as president, the deep state's real, and watch me get shot in the head, and everybody, sees it. But seriously,
Yeah, yeah, that's what Roger Craig said. He said anybody that investigates this case, they must be prepared to pay the full price. Okay, and Roger Craig did pay that full price. But I think enough time has gone by. I think you're safe. I think you'll be okay.
well, Steve, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. I'm gonna link all your links in the description. Thanks for listening to this episode. Out of the